Hello students, this is Mr. Martyr. I'm coming to you with your Field Classroom on Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is about political participation and voter identification. So in Unit 2, we're moving away from the constitutional, the legal side of the class. So for the past two units, Units 1 and 6, we look at the Constitution, we look at federalism. Now we're going to look at politics and campaigning. So in order to do that, we have to look at first, what is a voter? What makes up a voter? So first, how do Americans participate in the political world? And let's take a look at our turnout of presidential voters in presidential election years from 1789 to 2016. Um, the big trend that I want you guys to notice is that consistently since really 1960, Americans have been voting in presidential elections roughly 50 to 58% of the time. That still means a large percentage of Americans, anywhere between 40 to 45%, do not come out and vote. And in a republic as ours, it's important because decisions are made by those who show up. And you guys can see that, we saw a drop in the 1990s as polarization in politics was on the rise. We saw an increase in voter turnout in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. And then again, voter participation dropped in 2012 and rose a little bit in 2016. So on the level, we're hitting maybe 58%, 59% of registered voters are turning out. But as a political scientist, we'd always love to see those numbers just a bit higher. So why didn't people turn out in the 2016 election? Well, a couple things, and you're going to see that we use the Pew Research Center for a lot of our data. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides some pretty good data. And in the later part of this chapter in class, we're going to take a look at what constitutes valid data versus invalid data. So a couple things. People who registered to vote, a large percentage of them, 25%, said that they just didn't like either candidates. Another 15% said that, their vote wouldn't make a difference. And then a lot of people, 14% said they're too busy. I mean, if you stop to think about it, how often in your daily life do you think about politics? Now, maybe your answer is going to be a little different because you're a political science student. But most people, in their general routine, they're looking at the news at a casual glance. And additionally, look, you've got 3% of the population that forgot to vote. Given the fact that both campaigns spend millions of dollars on advertisements and other forms of get out the vote process, you would hope that people wouldn't forget that there was an election. So a large part of the electorate does not vote, and we're going to explore, maybe that's just as strong of a statement as people who do vote. All right, so what is public opinion? Well, a couple things. Public opinion is the distribution of the population's political beliefs about politics and policy issues. Everyone has an opinion on every issue. All right, some people may agree on certain issues, others will disagree. And we're going to take a look at how politicians measure public opinion and how they use public opinion to formulate policy decisions. We're going to look at demography, which is the science of population changes. And we're going to look at the census, which is a tool for understanding population changes. As we said when we examined the Constitution, we're coming up on the 2020 census, so we'll be looking to see what states are gaining representatives and electoral votes and which states are losing. Several governorships are up for election in 2018, which is going to be pivotal to who controls the state legislature as far as redistricting goes. So this is a big year for that, especially when we're talking about population and public opinion. All right, so I think your textbook focuses a little bit on the immigrant story. They focus on the fact that the United States is a nation of immigrants. So why is this important? Well, this is important for several reasons, because in order to understand the United States, you have to understand its immigration history, because that's where we get a lot of our values from. So beginning in the late 19th century, we saw Northwestern Europeans move to the United States, and with that, they brought their political ideologies. I mean, if you think about the people that came over on the Mayflower and in Jamestown, the early founding fathers, they were all influenced by events from the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Just like new immigrants coming to this country will be influenced by things happening in their country. Um, we saw a huge migration from Southern and Eastern Europe in the late 19th and 20th century as a reaction to World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And now in the 20th century, we're seeing a huge migration of Hispanics and Asians into the United States. It's also interesting, too, and something that I don't think we pay enough attention to is that for being a nation of immigrants, the United States, regardless of who the immigrant is, has always had a attitude of disdain towards immigrants, the idea of disdain towards newcomers. In Boston, we've heard the no Irish need apply. We've seen prejudices there. But America, in reality, is a great melting pot of blended cultures, and our government, we seek to reflect that in its values. Um, we are heading towards what's called the minority majority, and this is the emergence of a non-white Caucasian majority. And political scientists believe that'll be coming up in maybe 10 to 20 years as population shifts. And with it, the political culture will also shift over time. So again, this is just showing you guys in chart form the non-white Hispanic or the white non-Hispanic population is on the decline, and by after 2050, that number should differentiate. But that really plays a bigger stake into the Hispanic population coming to the United States. Roughly, there's 57.5 million Americans that are of Hispanic descent. And that number, as you guys can see by this chart, again from Pew, it's on the rise. It's increasing. Again, this is important to understand because Hispanics are moving into certain states that we would consider conservative. Perhaps their political opinions and political beliefs will change and flip those states electorally. And now remember, go back to the original definition of politics. It's who gets what and where and when and how. So the fact that conservatives are taking this hardcore stance on immigration, if they want to capitalize on this huge voting base that's coming into the country, perhaps they need to soften their views on immigration. If not, the Democrats stand to benefit the most from this influx of Hispanics. All right. We said America is the melting pot. African Americans have faced a legacy of racism. We've talked a little bit about that when we address civil rights. We said Hispanics are faced with the biggest problem, including illegal immigration. And I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about that with President Trump and the Congress coming in debating the DREAM Act and the DACA recipients. But we're looking at how those populations have changed. All right. America, again, known as the melting pot, we look at regional shifts. So really in 1940, prior to World War I, a lot of the population was in the north, in the North New England states. After World War II, that population begins to shift. People begin to move south and west into what's called the Sun Belt. So in the chart up top, you see like states like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania are all bigger in populations. But after that, we see California, Texas, Florida begin to explode, Illinois expand, even Ohio, as people are moving out of the Northeast into other parts of the country. Why is this important? Again, this is going to shift the balance of elected representatives in those states. So New England states that are traditionally liberal or Democrat, they are losing seats in Congress, whereas people are moving into these southern, more conservative states. They may be gaining representatives in that regard. So we could see an increased number of southern congressional districts, which may favor the one party over another. All right. So one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is that the fastest growing age group is the age group over 65, the baby boomers. They're retiring in large numbers. One of the problems is it's a drain on Social Security. Biggest, and we will talk about this in a later unit when we talk about entitlements and the government and the budget. In 1942, and this is a staggering statistic, in 1942, 42 workers could pay for one retiree on Social Security. That's tremendous. Now, because baby boomers are retiring in such large numbers, that number has been inverted. Now, by 2040, right at the time when you guys are really hitting your prime in the workforce, two workers can pay for one retiree on Social Security. So that number has completely inverted. And it's because there's a great number of people that are retiring. So something about Social Security needs to be done. So something about that entitlement program needs to be reformed. The problem is, again, older people, as you guys will see, are more likely to vote and therefore have a stronger political voice than younger people. So they are electing people in office who protect Social Security and want to kind of keep the status quo system. However, there is some new research done by Pew that a new generation is going to be the fastest growing, and that is of my generation, the millennials, believe it or not. By 2050, our group should be at roughly like 79 million in our generation. And you guys can see just looking at this chart. So by 2015, we're roughly even, but now we're beginning to see the millennials overtake the baby boomers. So the baby boomers, you'll see in a second, they were the people born after World War II. But as we get, obviously as they get older, they're dying off in numbers. So millennials will be the new dominant force. This is going to be very interesting. And this is, again, a different chart, same chart, just in different format. Currently, we've got 47 million people. They're known as the silent generation. Not for silent films, but Richard Nixon called them the silent majority. They came of age from 1928 to 1946, so they grew up during the Great Depression. So think maybe grandparents, people in their 80s, 90s. Okay, the baby boomers is 1946 to 1965. So Mr. Martirone's parents, possibly your own parents if they were born right around that cutoff. I imagine some of your parents are born probably in the late 60s, maybe even early 70s. So they're a little older, but you have to understand American history in this process. So you've got the silent generation. They're influenced by the Roaring '20s, followed by Great Depression, followed by the World Wars. You've got the baby boomer generation of the 1940s, but also the 1960s. They remember, the Kennedy assassination and Woodstock and the moon landings when the Warren Court was at its height in the 1960s, liberalism in America. Then you've got Generation X, and they were influenced by the late 70s and distrusting government. And then you've got millennials like Mr. Martin, who grew up with the Clinton presidency and were in college during the Bush presidency, and we came to adulthood with the Obama presidency. So what's interesting is that the older generations in the 1920s, they're more accustomed to free market economics. They grew up with the hardline Cold War mentality where communism and leftist politics is bad. But as this generation dies out, they're going to be replaced by people who were more comfortable with leftist politics, baby boomers and millennials. So as those generations turn out to vote, the big question is, will the trend continue where the voting stays more leftist and the country moves to the left? Or will the trend remain that the older you get, the more conservative you vote? We're going to talk a little bit more about that theory in class. And then, of course, there's the post-millennial age, which some of you guys may fit into, those of you guys that were born after 1998, which I think may be all of you by this point. All right. And again, this is just another Pew showing you guys how the baby boomer generation, which was the greatest generation, is on decline, and the millennial generation is on the rise. More millennials voted in this past election than before. So we're going to talk a little bit about political socialization. And one of the things that you need to understand is that the person or people that shape your political beliefs are your parents. They are, from an early age, they shift your political viewpoints. Now, it's not to say that you're always going to have the same viewpoints as your parents. You may not. But a lot of the things you're going to grow up. For example, if you grow up in a conservative household today, you're probably going to have, for example, Fox News on. Maybe it's on talk radio, maybe it's on the TV. But that's what you're going to grow up accustomed to. For example, if you are growing up in a more liberal household, you may have like MSNBC on. You may familiarize yourself with different writings, different political commentators. And again, that begins to sink in. And you may not even realize it. That's the other thing. If you're not politically astute, you wouldn't really know, left or right, but that's where you're getting your politics from. And when you come into class and voice your opinions, lots of times people will voice the opinions that they hear from their parents because that's the one set of adults that they trust. After that, political socialization is felt by teachers and other educators, and then really your group of friends. But again, if you stop to think about it, when you grow up, your parents typically will buy a house, um, and their next door neighbors are buying a house that's relatively the same amount, which means your neighbors are in the same socioeconomic group, which means additionally that people will tend to have the same political viewpoints, which means people living in neighborhoods will tend to have similar viewpoints. I'm not saying everyone's going to have the same political viewpoint, and I've seen plenty of exceptions where children have completely different viewpoints of their parents, and that's perfectly fine. But traditionally, we adopt the political viewpoints of at least one of our parents in the socialization process. Right. The other thing, and again, this is kind of, I jumped ahead of myself, but mass media, okay, where we get our information from, okay, there's a huge generation gap. For example, a lot of our grandparents, they're used to getting the news from channels 3, 6, and 10. And now our parents are more accustomed to getting the news from the cable news network. People like yourselves in the post-millennial generation, a lot of you guys are not getting your news from the actual physical TV networks, but you're getting it from your social media. And that's why one of the things that we're talking a lot about when we talk about the mass media is, social media and the idea of fake news and disinformation. How do we get the idea that news that's online that you're reading on your own is credible? So parents are going to be the first step of political association, mass media, and then school. And I'm not so much public education, but when you guys go away to college, again, you're going to, find that people that can afford a certain college are, again, in your same demographic, socioeconomic demographic. So again, you may identify and hang out with people that have the same political viewpoints, even though we're always told to try and hang out and socialize with more diverse people, but it's actually not the case. All right. Political leanings over a lifetime. As you age, you become more conservative. That is a fact. It's not a theory. Um, Also, voter turnout increases with age. And again, we've talked a little bit about this. When you're younger, in your 20s, you're really not thinking about politics. You're not hungry for politics. You're not consuming news and information. You feel a lot of this information really doesn't apply to you. But as you get older, as you enter your first job, as you begin paying taxes, as you purchase a home, you begin to vote more often. And then if you guys look, 55 to 64, 65 to 74, 75 to 80, that demographic is voting at 60% or higher. The older people have a little bit more time on their hands. They can consume more news. They're sitting as they're retired. They concern more about their benefits. They are more protective of the status quo. So in that regard, you've got people, again, more likely to vote. And that has been a pretty solid bedrock principle that the older you get, the more likely you are to vote. And that's something that we've talked about before in class. All right. I'm going to stop right here with how polls are conducted. We're going to pick this up in class when we look at polling and data in the meantime. But if you need to watch this video again, please do so. Like I said, this was just about kind of political socialization and the political process. But again, you want to start reading chapter 6 and begin that guided reading.